Hi everyone, Sajid Amit here, and welcome to my shootout of three Campfire IEMs. So, Campfire is, of course, a brand that is very well known. They're from Portland, Oregon, and in many ways, they are one of the brands that audiophiles cut their teeth with in the IEM section of the hobby. Founded by Ken Ball, a lot of you might know who've been around in the hobby that Ken Ball was originally associated with Allo Audio, which produced premium cables for headphones and IEMs. And what's interesting about Campfire is that they have been systemically and repeatedly known to push the boundaries of portable audio. I mean, these guys have been famous for their extensive catalog of IEMs and, of course, the Andromeda, the very classic green shell Andromeda, which does to some extent look a bit like the Moon Rover. The Moon Rover does draw inspiration from the aesthetics of the Andromeda. Is very well known. A lot of people own the Andromeda when they sort of try to graduate into the upper echelons of, IEM ownership. Of course, the Andromeda was around $1,000, but these are far more expensive. I mean, not exactly. These two, the Supermoon, which I have on the left, and the Moon Rover, are still in the realm of $1,000, but these guys are their planar flagship, and I'm not going to take the cable out of this because I really like it with this cable. It looks pretty. These are the Astrolith acoustics cable, courtesy of a lot of horns and stuff going around me. I live in a very noisy city, so I apologize in advance for all the surround sounds and stuff that might come in. Lee can do this video. Okay, this is the Astrolith, which is their flagship planar, and it's astounding. So of course, these are far less expensive than the Astrolith, so in many ways one might beg the question that is this review even useful, because these are lower price and the Astrolith is higher price. But I think the shootout is just for the sake of titling it as a shootout, but more importantly, I do want to draw out the comparisons in the sound signatures of these three IEMs, because they all have very different sonic profiles, very different tunings. The Moon Rover and the Astrolith are in many ways, they come after the Supermoon. The Supermoon was the first serious planar, and it did catch the world by storm in some ways, at least in the Summit sections of the hobby, because a lot of people who own multi-kilobuck IEMs often use this in line or in conjunction with their IEMs that cost 3 times more, because this is very resolving and very bassy, and in many ways a bass lover's delight. The Moon Rover tries to offer a very different take on their planar tunings, and of course now then you have the Astrolith, which is, like I said, an astounding IEM. Okay, to jump right into discussion on specs and pricing and all that, the Supermoon is priced at $1,100. All is often now available as of October 2024 at discounted price points that can hover around $800 or $900. The Moon Rover is priced at $1,200, so $100 more than the Supermoon. The Astrolith is $2,200, so a clear $1,000 difference between the Moon Rover. And this has a 14mm full range planar. This also has a 14mm full range planar. This incidentally has a dual planar, so 14mm main plus a 6mm planar tweeter. Impedance wise, this is 15.5 ohms. This is again 15.5 ohms. This is 8.2 ohms, so it has a lower impedance, and sensitivity is 94 decibels for all of these. Now, of course, this is a 3D printed acrylic and a stainless steel faceplate, as is pretty evident. This is titanium with flame treatment for the shell, which does look beautiful because this has this interesting coloration, a gradation of colors, if you can see this in the light. And of course, this is similarly 3D printed acrylic with stainless steel faceplate. Now, in terms of appearance, of course, the Supermoon and the Astrolith is similar in appearance. A lot of people are wondering if this, I'll just take this off, if the Astrolith is bigger in size because it has 2 planars, but it's not. Honestly speaking, these are pretty comparable in size. I'm not sure if you can make out the sort of size differences, but in many ways, this has a smoother contour, and this has more edges and more curves. So in many ways, I do find Astrolith to be somewhat smaller in size and in many ways more comfortable and ergonomic. This is obviously very ergonomic. It's a well-worn shape and design. This casing, this housing is very well regarded and well known to the audiophile community. So this is, of course, no surprise. And so they're all pretty comfortable. So I do want to talk a bit about the sound, which is what this review is about. So starting with tonality and timbre. Now see, planar inner IEMs oftentimes sound very similar, coming from the same company. Like if you look at the Hyphaben Aria or the Hyphaben Edition XS, or the Hyphaben Susvara, or the HE1000 SE. The Susvara perhaps sounds timbrally somewhat different. It does have a very advanced planar driver, but in many ways, Aria, the Edition XS, and the HE1000 headphones from Hyphaben sound very similar. They graph similarly. They have a very similar timbre. The timbre does, to some extent, get influenced by the treble presentation, which can vary in their peaks and valleys across these Hyphaben headphones. And in some cases, one Hyphaben headphone perhaps has sort of, just a little more sub bass than the others and so forth. But they're all similar in their sort of tuning. Even with Odyssey headphones, you have a very similar tuning profile, with the exception of the LCD5 and headphones that came after the planars. So in general, the house sound persists. But what's really ridiculously impressive about Campfire is that all these IEMs have very different tuning profiles. It's really, really interesting because, while the Astrolith has a bassy, somewhat U-shaped tonality, with a very impressive emphasis on the low end, the Moon Rover is perhaps the most neutral planar IEM I've come across. It's not analytical, but it's neutral, and I think it's a beautiful sort of distinction between how you can tune an IEM to sound neutral without making it sound analytical. The Supermoon perhaps is a little more colored and warmer and thicker sounding than even the Astrolith. So this is for people who like to play a lot of heavy metal, and this is something that I think a lot of people who like the For Audio XE6 also have liked. The XE6 is of course $4,000, but I actually prefer this to the XE6 to the extent that I sold the XE6 after getting it, because this, just like the For Audio XE6, is a very heavy bass, well-rounded, rotund bass, sub-bass, mid-bass balance, and all that. This also has a very heavy bass, but in many ways is tighter, cleaner, and this is strikingly more resolving. And one of the most resolving IEMs on the planet, despite the $2,000 price point. I do not mean to scoff at the price point. I understand $2,000 is expensive for some people, or perhaps for everyone. But I still want to point out that this is, incredibly resolving for its price. But I will cover that in greater detail. Now, I do think that this is a milestone for Campfire Audio because a lot of times planars are generally, respected for their technical prowess as opposed to timbre or tonality. But this is very well tuned. The Moon Rover, like I said, is very accurate and it's almost something that I think a lot of studio guys can use. It has a no-frill sort of a sound, but then again, it does change its sound characteristics depending on what you drive it with. So if you drive it with the Sony W1ZM2, it takes on the richer character of that source and reveals that source for what it is. And like I said, the Supermoon has tremendous lower mids and proper note weight and impressive vocals as well, I do want to point out. It's not just a one-trick pony in that it just does bass well. Speaking of bass, I think bass quantity and quality and the balance thereof remains a rarity, even in the flagship space. However, I do think the Astrolith's bass is unique in the sense that it's visceral, it's deep, and therefore it's authoritative because it's visceral, I suppose. Yet it has great precision, nuance, and control. Like, I've never really enjoyed bass drums on IEMs as much as I have on this one. And kick drums and snares even just come to life with this because it also has the treble lift at the right points, which is testimony to the artful and creative tuning that Campfire repeatedly churns out. There are a lot of other bassy IEMs out there, but I honestly would choose this as my current favorite bass head IEM, including the Trifecta, which I have raved about. The Trifecta is a wondrous IEM, and I'm thinking of doing like a best audiophile products of the decade, and I want to include Trifecta in that, because Trifecta is just our triumph in that it's so uniquely tuned. But this, I think, competes with the Trifecta in terms of its delectable tuning, and I dare say that this is less divisive than the Trifecta because the Trifecta had oodles of lower mids an upper bass. This has a little more constrained a lower mids and upper bass, whilst presenting enough warmth from that region. This is likely to be less divisive than the trifecta, and I'm quite certain of this because it doesn't sound unusually warm in that region, and it also doesn't have the treble creativity of the trifecta, because trifecta has a certain treble presentation in mid and upper treble that can be off-putting to some people. It wasn't for me, and I covered this at some depth in my trifecta review, so I really urge you guys to check out my trifecta review, because things I say there are not applicable to these IEMs, because trifecta is a highly colored presentation in perhaps one of the most tasteful ways possible. None of these IEMs, I think, are as colored as the trifecta, with the exception of the Supermoon, which is rivaling their trifecta for coloration, yet being not as colored. And I think this is perhaps in many ways the safest, yet very tastefully tuned and artfully tuned planar or IEM that Campfire has come out with. The Moon Rover, like I said, is more conservative in that it's more traditionally analytical, yet it does have a strong bass presence. I mean, just because it's a more conservative approach to tuning does not mean that it eschews or avoids bass. Its bass quantity is still higher than other IEMs that are known for bass in this price range, like the Sony IER M9 or the Symphonium Helios or the Symphonium Crimson. The Astrolith, of course, which, like I said, is twice expensive, is a different league of bass. But honestly speaking, if you are just a bass head and if you want something in the $1,000 price point, you might just want to get a Supermoon, because it's just wonderful. It's just like a subwoofer and it's amazing. But then again, I have a friend who loves this bass the most because it's in some ways the most neutral, but I prefer the bass here. And I do think most audiophiles will prefer the bass of the flagship planar, the Astrolith. Okay, now in terms of mid-range, the Astrolith has a slightly U-shaped mid-range like I discussed, but it's not V-shaped. The upper mids are not pulled back to the point that, you miss the upper mids presence, because this does have presence and it sounds natural. It's just ever so slightly pushed back in the mix, which becomes evident only when you A/B with the Moon Rover, right? But this is still the most refined of all three in terms of the mid-range, because the nuance in this mid-range and the resolution in this mid-range, I mean, the level of detail this can extract from mid-range, honestly speaking, it rivals $5,000-$6,000 IEMs like the Urmodi Jewel and the Traley. But unlike the Traley, which I think has a mid-range focus, mostly because the bass is pretty weak in the Traley, and the the treble in the Traley or on the Traley is also quite scooped and weak rather. This has treble presence and this has bass presence, so you get a very velvety and smooth mid-range without any instance of grit or leanness. And like I said, the resolution of this mid-range is just mind-blowing. Every tiny vibration of guitar strings and breath or breathiness of vocals and will come through with this. And it's just stunning how the mid-range is done here. And while this has an uncolored mid-range, like I said, it is not as sweet sounding as the Astrolith, but it does outperform other monitors in this price range for its timbre and resolution. And what Campfire is increasingly giving you, especially with these three, is just bang for the buck in regard to performance, in regard to technicalities, in regard to resolution. So this has an amazing mid-range, and there are very few IEMs in this price category that can rival this for mid-range. And finally, the mid-range here is thicker, it's dynamic, it's lively, and it does complement its bass response well, which is the reason why, honestly, guys, before I got these in, this was my daily driver. And I like the Supermoon, I still do, and I have used it for my walks and in the gym, because while I can play tracks that don't token bass frequencies and still the mid-range sounds lovely like vocal bass tracks, I do like my rock and metal when I'm in the gym, and this does hit the ball out of the park for rock and metal. Now, coming to treble, like I said, the Astrolith has treble presence, and I do think this has really noticeable treble performance because the extension is noticeable. It reaches the farthest reaches of treble frequencies, air frequencies, yet sounds smooth and linear. So with Campfire IEMs, I mean, oftentimes you should not get fooled by what a Campfire IEM graphs like, because I often notice that these IEMs don't sound like the graph because the positioning of the peaks and troughs in the treble frequencies are often a function in terms of how you perceive them, a function of your ear anatomy. So I might sort of perceive a certain treble peak in the air frequencies, which will not bother me, but you might perceive it in the mid treble. However, this does not exhibit the treble sort of creativity of the Campfire triple dynamic drivers, right? Because this, honestly speaking, has, in a certain sense, a slightly more balanced treble in the trifecta, the triple dynamic driver. This treble is slightly more normal. Yes, it's got peaks, but as does the focal clear. These peaks have a very interesting way of playing with each other and canceling themselves out, so much so that you get the treble for what it's good at, which is getting definition, which is getting attack in the electric guitars, the snare drum, but it does not veer into sibilance territory. And I've also tried this with brighter sounding sources, like my basso sources, namely the DX260, and it never, ever broke into the sibilant side of treble. I would say that this is far less fatiguing than even the Subtonic Storm or the Elysian Annihilator. The Elysian Annihilator is well regarded for its treble, and I would actually compare this for treble presentation with Annihilator, because the treble is meant to sound lively, guys, and it does give you a bit of that without crossing into sibilant territory. Now, I do want to mention that the Moon Rover has a little more subdued treble region, right? And when you switch back and forth, I mean, you do need some time to get your brain to burn in, but to my ear, the Moon Rover sounded ever so slightly warmer in the treble. Safer, perhaps. Now, it does still resolve finer details in the treble, so that's worth keeping in mind. A lot of people opine or posit or argue that the treble is proportional to, or treble energy is proportional to resolution, and I beg to differ, because I don't think that even if there is a correlation, it's yet to be borne out by evidence, and there might be a correlation between treble and resolution, but it's not an absolute correlation, meaning the correlation is not 1. There's probably some correlation somewhere, because in this case, the treble resolution is perhaps far more impressive than a lot of other monitors like Symphonium IEMs, but it does not sound piercing, and it sounds a little more resolving than I think Symphonium IEMs do. Now, the Supermoon continues the same tradition of having some treble energy, just like the Astrolith does, but it doesn't get bright. It is still a warm presentation. Overall, guys, these are warm IEMs. This is warmer. This is closer to neutral and slightly U-shaped. This is the most neutral of all these tunings. Now, technical performance is, of course, very important for us to discuss, because with planars, you do want technical performance, because planars are able to retrieve more detail oftentimes. And it's true with these IEMs. These are some of the most technical IEMs right now on the planet, although these are $1,000 sort of, ish, and this is $2,000. I would just want to drive the point home that although it's $2,000, and for pride of possession, we often like buying IEMs that are even more expensive, like the Jewels and the Traileys, and now you have the Fokagu or something that's been created by Brise Audio in Japan. That's $16,000, which is just different vista for IEM price points. Of course, Fokagu has a cable, a Brise cable, which is expensive, and has a Brise amplifier. But then again, I still think it's a little too expensive given what it offers, although I'm not yet to try it. I just feel like it shouldn't cost as much as it does, the Fokagu. But anyway, moving on from that sort of, minor sort of quibble about pricing, this is impressive, because at $2,000, I think this beats the Trailey for resolution. I think it competes with the Jewel for resolution, and I think it handily situates itself in the sort of upper tiers of IEMs priced at $5,000-$6,000 for resolution, for dynamic slam and punch, and for soundstage width, and for imaging precision, and for blackness of background. So timbre here is is fine. There's nothing wrong with this timbre that I perceive. In fact, I find it to be quite largely natural sounding. In fact, I find the timbre to be on the same level as a dynamic driver headphone, like a focal headphone. It sounds great. Drum sounds great. Vocal sounds great. And I like it for timbre. I actually love it for its overall technical presentation, and I love it for its overall performance. And I honestly think this is one of my top 2 IEMs, along with the Software's Enigma, but I've talked about that on several Head5 posts and all that. Meanwhile, this guy here is noticeably less resolving than these Astrolith, but still, like I said, it's very resolving for the price. It's up there with Symphonium IEMs, which are also very resolving for the price. Great soundstage width and depth, and just a very nice and inviting sense of dynamics and timbre without necessarily winning the prize for dynamics, because this is still more dynamic, as is this. Timbrally, the Supermoon is great. It's warm. It's in that sense, it's not as perhaps analytical. If you really want to listen to a lot of jazz and classical, this might not be your best bet for timbre. But if you like rock and metal like I do, or vocal-based music, this is just amazing for timbre, guys. And this has soundstage width, no more so than the average $1,000 IEM, and the most amazing sound, slam and punch and sense of dynamics at this price point that you can get. For $1,000, this is like the best IEM for slam. So where does that leave us, guys? Basically, I mean, if you're in the market for a Summit-Fi IEM, you should just get this. And yeah, I mean, in every video that I make, I do caution against blind buying. But if I've ever come close to urging anyone to blind buy an IEM, this would be it. I still wouldn't recommend blind buying anything just out of ethics. So I would still recommend, giving this an audition if possible, because what might be the best IEM for me, and like I said, it's one of my current top 2 IEMs, that might not be the case for you because of your different ear anatomy, right? However, I mean, I still think that if this is perhaps the closest I can come to recommending a blind buy along with the Software's Enigma, but this is just fantastic. If you're looking for a flagship Summit-Fi IEM in 2024 towards the end of the year, this would be my pick, guys. If you are someone who wants to listen to jazz and classical and such audiophile genres, then of course this would be my pick. And in many ways, if you want to be within a budget of around $1,000, then of course, then again, this would be my pick. If you are looking for fun and just a lot of fun and dynamic slam and punch and warmth, if you like rock and metal and vocal-based music, male and female, then this would be my pick. And especially if you have a bright source, this is, I think, fantastic. This works with any source, honestly, and this also works with any source. So that's my shootout, guys. These are all some fantastic IEMs that are offering very different sort of propositions with regard to tuning profiles and sonic profiles. And for that, Campfire Audio, kudos to you guys. You are innovating at a very, very impressive rate. And yeah, shout out to you guys. I hope you keep innovating at this aggressive price points. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for the next one. Bye-bye.